Everyone, welcome to another lecture in forensic psychology. Today we are going to be talking about aggression and violent crimes and discussing the distinction between the issues of aggression and violent crimes and the different types of violent crimes that also exist, and also some possible psychological factors and situational factors that might contribute to the aspects of violent crime and aggression. So first, before we begin, let's first talk about what aggression means. Aggression is really defined as a behavior that has at its goal the infliction of harm upon another person who is in turn motivated to avoid the harm. In other words, a person who is wanting to harm other individuals and the other individual does not want to be harmed is receiving the aggressive act in that particular instance. Now, we do have other definitions associated with aggression. For instance, the definition that aggression refers to a number of types of forceful behaviors. It can be defined as emotional energy channeled towards achieving a goal in sports, business, or even other areas. So here we even see a definition of aggression that seems to be almost more socially acceptable in terms of some of the behaviors that an individual might channel that emotional energy towards. But whenever it is that we're thinking about aggression and the correlation that it has with violent crimes, we're really discussing the first definition that we've mentioned here about this aspect of inflicting harm upon another person who does not want to have that harm inflicted upon them. So in terms of that aspect of emotionality associated with aggression, we definitely do see that there is what we also call affective or hostile aggression, which is impulsive or thoughtless and driven by anger. And ultimately the goal is to harm an individual or a specific target of interest. Now, we also have what are called instrumental aggression, which is a premeditated means of obtaining some goal other than just by harming a victim. And in these particular instances, aggression might also potentially lead to violence. So when we think of aggression, aggression is really the aspect of intent, the aspect of emotion associated with wanting to create harm towards another individual, while violence is really more of the act that involves the physical force with or without a weapon that results in harm, injury, or death towards another person. So in some particular instances, violence may occur without aggression, and aggression may occur also without violence, and in some instances of violence can definitely occur with aggression in mind. So when we think of different forms of aggression and how violence is also accepted by society and aggression is accepted by society in some particular instances, we do see that there are socially approved aggressions that in some instances individuals might encounter or act upon. We also see some non-socially approved aggressions. So when we think about socially approved aggressions, think about, for instance, physical contact sports like football, rugby, boxing, MMA. Those are going to be socially approved aggressions, even though for many years some of those types of aggressive acts were not necessarily socially accepted, especially when you think about MMA. I remember when I was a child, MMA was already around, but we didn't necessarily call it MMA at that time. But it seemed to be the more violent of sports. It wasn't readily available to everyone for viewing purposes, and now it seems to be much more socially acceptable as an alternative to something like boxing that's been around for quite some time. We also do have socially approved violence and also non-socially approved violence, and depending on the society that one may live in, you may also see differences in terms of what is going to be considered to be socially approved and what is non-socially approved aggression and violence as well. So depending on your culture or your specific nationality, you might have differences in terms of what an individual might view as aggression or violence and what is acceptable in terms of aggression and also violence. So what are some possible causes of aggression and also violence? There's a couple of different views as to what might be possible causes, and here we say possible causes, not necessarily that they are the specific causes associated with aggression and violence, because again, we don't have 100% definitive proof. We have more of relationships associated with some of these potential factors, but we definitely do see that early training takes a big part or plays a major role in terms of predicting aggression and also violence. So we see this quite frequently whenever it is that a person is taught from a very early age that they should be able to display aggressive or violent acts, or they see this also in their family or in their cultural upbringing, such as with point number 3. Some individuals might just be biologically predisposed to being a little bit more aggressive than others because of higher levels of testosterone or other issues that might arise from a biological perspective that might potentially predict higher levels of aggression and also violence. Instinct is going to play a major role also in terms of us displaying aggression and violence, especially when our life is threatened, right? So if we have physical harm that's coming towards us, we are not just going to stand there and essentially allow violence or even aggressive acts to be taken upon us, but rather we will defend ourselves to be able to survive in those particular instances. So by instinct, in some instances, we may be able to employ aggression and also violence. The media seems to influence a lot as well in terms of how it is that individuals act in terms of aggression and also violence. And last, the use of alcohol as being a major predictor in terms of an individual potentially becoming aggressive or also violent after consumption of alcohol or drugs of other sorts. Now, when we think of early training, we see that the work of Albert Bandura, who is a very famous psychologist, who did instrumental work associated with social learning theory and the imitation of aggression. He was very famously known in the 60s for having created what was called the famous Bobo doll study, which essentially looked at the aspects of imitation of aggression. And I've put the link in Blackboard for the video for the Bobo doll study, so that way you all will be able to watch it and be able to see the work that he did associated with the Bobo doll study. But ultimately, what Bandura found was that by individuals essentially looking at other individuals create aggressive acts, they were much more likely to then also create aggressive acts in the future and imitate the behavior of who it is that they saw, especially if those individuals that they saw were peers or people that they wanted to view as peers in those specific instances. And we also do see that social learning theory does also predict this aspect associated with imitation of behavior, that individuals who receive punishment, especially by their parents, they become much more aggressive as adults, and they are actually much more likely to also display levels of aggression or punishment towards other individuals. So take the case, for instance, with spanking. It's always been said that if your parents spanked you, you're much more likely to spank your children, and so on and so forth. So we have to break that cycle. And the idea goes behind this idea of social learning theory, that because you learn this from a very early age, you're also much more likely to be able to do that in the future. And you may potentially use it as a disciplinary style, or even just as a method of inflicting punishment or pain on other individuals. So we definitely see that with children, especially that children are so impressionable from a very early age, that whenever it is that they do see peers, especially peers that play some central role to their idea of who it is that they are, that makeup of that idea of their self, taking into consideration the parents, friends, teachers that they may see, children are much more likely to imitate their behavior and thus potentially also imitate aggressive or violent behavior that might potentially be displayed by those individuals. Now, we also see that biology plays a major role in terms of aggression and violence, and generally what we tend to see is that males tend to have higher levels of testosterone, and since males have higher levels of testosterone, we actually do see that there's an increase in the amount of adrenaline that's released by the body whenever testosterone levels increase. So this seems to be a very large predictor whenever it is that we actually see aggressive or violent acts taking hold or taking place, that essentially that release of that adrenaline because of the testosterone increase, the testosterone in males specifically, are ultimately going to potentially allow them to create some aggressive acts in the future. Now, this does not necessarily mean that just because males have testosterone, they will naturally be more aggressive than individuals who have less testosterone or anything like that, but rather there just seems to be that relationship in this particular case. Now, we also do have some biological theories associated with aggression and with violence. Some of the primary biological theories that we actually have discussed aggression as being this body constitution theory, also called physiognomy. Physiognomy was a study of facial features, and then later on phrenology came about and studied the bumps on the heads, and many of us have actually heard of the aspects of phrenology in many of our psychology courses, especially in Introduction to Psychology or even Personality Psychology, where you discuss the aspect of phrenology and feeling the bumps on a person's head, ultimately indicating if we can identify specific characteristics associated with that individual. The aspect of physiognomy was the exact same thing, but now was just a study of facial features, and and using them to being able to understand and predict aggression or violence in other individuals. Now, we also definitely see that we can try to create, or it's been attempted to create, specific criminal personalities based on the psyche of individuals, or essentially trying to explain why it is that individuals also create aggressive acts, looking at it from a much more biological aspect, looking at individuals being primed from early stages of evolution and their primitive stages of evolution as ultimately being predictors of an individual's aggression and violence, and ultimately their drive to live in those particular instances, their drive to be able to have safety and survive in their environments. Now, there's many other theories associated with these aspects of biology in terms of violence and aggression. The use of drugs has been central to our discussions associated with violence, and how some of these psychiatric medications might potentially lead individuals to have psychotic breaks and potentially lead them to create aggressive or violent acts. We also see other individuals, whenever it is that they create aggressive acts and they're taking specific types of drugs. We even saw this with some of the individuals that were responsible for the shootings at Columbine and other shootings around the United States, that were supposedly taking drugs at that point in time that may have potentially created an idea for them to be able to act out in terms of their violent or aggressive acts. We also see that there's a very interesting super male syndrome that's created by having an XXY or XYY super males, and researchers actually believe that having that extra Y chromosome is actually responsible for increased aggressiveness for individuals. So these individuals that we find to be highly aggressive may potentially have that extra Y chromosome, thus leading to the higher levels of aggression in comparison to a male that only has XY chromosomes and do not have that additional Y chromosome in that particular instance. Now, also, we definitely do see that the neurotransmitter serotonin seems to be inversely related to violence. So it seems that whenever it is that we have higher levels of serotonin being released by our brains, we actually have lower levels of violence. So contrary to that would be that if we have lower levels of serotonin, we would actually have higher levels of violence being displayed. And we also see the amygdala as being very important and associated with the aspects of aggressiveness. And essentially what we tend to find is that if individuals have some type of damage to the amygdala, or have some type of suppression of the amygdala, we might end up finding that they may have larger degrees of violence and aggression that they might potentially display. Now, going back to this aspect of social learning theory, whenever it is that we looked at this aspect of social learning theory, we can actually look at different parts associated with how it's believed that we learn information from a social perspective. First off, we can look at what's called the frustration aggression hypothesis, and this was proposed by Dollard back in 1939. That he proposed essentially that aggression is the result of frustration arising from interference with the desire for a goal response. So when you think about it, this seems to be a lot associated with the id. If you look at Freud's personality theory, that with the id is always trying to satisfy those primitive drives, always trying to satisfy any of those forces that it wants to be able to satisfy in those particular cases, and it'll do anything to be able to satisfy those drives, including potentially not following moral beliefs or social beliefs associated with society in terms of laws. So very similar to that, the frustration aggression hypothesis proposed by Dollard predicts that very similar aspect as well, that here the aggression is being created because there's this inability for the individual to be able to reach their goal that they're in search for. Now, later on in 1962, Berkowitz actually created what was called the revised frustration aggression hypothesis that looked at frustration only being created by a readiness for aggression. The eliciting cues in the environment determine if aggression or some other behavior may result. So in other words, frustration only primes up the aspects of aggression. So the individual starts becoming much more emotional and potentially becoming ready to become violent, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person will become violent and in capacity, because the aspect of them becoming aggressive or violent is going to depend primarily on those social cues that are out there. So assume, for instance, the aspect of a boxer. So a boxer gets taunted by another boxer on social media. That boxer now who's being taunted essentially is now starting to have this frustration, aggression starting to be created within them. So in other words, now they're getting ready to become aggressive, but yet it's not the right time for them to become aggressive and violent towards that other individual. Yet what might now happen is that once they get into the ring, now that aggression is released and violence takes place in that particular instance. Now, we also have what are called cognitive scripts within cognitive psychology, and for those of you who have taken cognitive psychology, you probably talk about this specific issue quite frequently, and with the idea of cognitive scripts, that essentially we have learned ways of responding to that are stored in a person's memory, which we use to guide our behavior and actually solve problems within a social situation. Essentially here we have these predispositions of information that we've already acquired throughout our lives, and we use them to be able to predict what it is that we're going to be doing in the future. The example I always give everyone in terms of this aspect of scripts is, imagine you going to eat at a restaurant, at Chili's for instance. There's a specific set of procedures that you're supposed to take within the dining experience of Chili's. Like, you arrive at the door, someone opens the door for you, or you open the door, you go to the hostess stand, the hostess goes and seats you or makes you wait for a couple of minutes while your table gets ready. Once you're seated, the waiter comes by or the waitress comes by, takes your order, and now they go back, bring your drink order, now you order your food, they leave, they come back, they see if everything is okay, they leave again, then they bring your food, you eat your food, and then you leave. That's the script that we've created based on that social experience. Now, the next time we go to another restaurant, if you go to Chili's, you're going to have those same expectations based on that previous experience. But if you go to McDonald's, even though they have similar menus in terms of serving similar food items like hamburgers, salads, and so on and so forth, you're not going to have the same experience. So if you go in with the script associated with Chili's to McDonald's, you're not going to ever get your food, and you're going to be waiting for a very long time. So you now have to have a revision to that script and know what differences you're going to have in different social situations. Now, we also see that the aspect of what Albert Bandura talked to us about in his breakthrough studies associated with imitation was that if we saw individuals performing some type of act, let that be through observation, through modeling, or even through reinforcement, we also want to be able to take upon those behaviors. And especially if other individuals are reinforcing us with the behaviors that we're imitating of others, we're much more likely to display those behaviors in the future. So here, think of, for instance, a child who is watching a pop star on TV dancing. The child now imitates that behavior. If the parents then reinforce that behavior and they clap, they smile, they sing along, they're very happy about the situation, the child is much more likely to continue doing the same behavior in the future. Albert Bandura wanted to be able to explore this aspect of modeling and observations of other individuals, but more from the aggression and the violence point of view associated with the child's behavior. So essentially what Albert Bandura and his team did is they had the children observing other individuals, other children and adults, taking out their aggression and being violent towards what was called a Bobo doll. A Bobo doll was these old school dolls that we used to have when we were children that essentially were filled with sand or with gravel on the bottom, and you would punch them or you would throw them and they would stand right back up because of the weight of the sand or the rocks that was at the bottom of the plastic doll. And these plastic dolls were about a child's height, a child who's about 6 or 7 years old. It wasn't that big, but it wasn't also that small in terms of the size of the doll. So ultimately here, what Bandura wanted to observe was, do the children actually imitate that behavior? And what did Bandura find? He found exactly what he thought was going to happen. That ultimately through observations, through modeling, and through reinforcement, the child actually displayed levels of aggression that were a lot higher than if they didn't observe an individual being aggressive or violent towards that Bobo doll. So ultimately he proposed that by other means of observation and also of modeling, children are easily influenced to also display some of these behaviors. Again, let those be aggressive or non-aggressive behaviors as well. So television and movies, for instance, are providing a very powerful source in terms of the behavior modeling that we actually see in terms of children and other other individuals within the family. And this is why in many instances now you'll actually see warning symbols given on specific TV shows so as to children not to actually do the behaviors that are being displayed there. And let's be honest with each other, we wish that those warning labels would work 100% of the time. They definitely do not. If we see somebody doing something really cool on TV, or especially when we were children, if we saw somebody really awesome, I did this when I was a kid, I saw MacGyver disarming all these explosive devices and things of that nature, and I would also go around and I would do that in my home, supposedly imitating MacGyver's behaviors. It all worked out fantastically until one day I got stuck to an electrical socket and I got shocked. And unfortunately, I never did that again, wanting to model or imitate the behavior associated with MacGyver in that particular instance. So we definitely see that these warnings don't always work 100% of the time, but they definitely are there as warnings to help deter individuals of potential harm that might occur in the future. Now, we also see that personality theories play a major role in terms of our discussions with aggression and with violence. And one of the things that we'll talk about here in terms of our distinction is the distinction between what we call narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. With narcissistic personality disorder, we have individuals with excessive degrees of narcissism that have an inflated sense of self-worth without a corresponding strong set of beliefs. So ultimately, these people are extremely sensitive to personal slights and criticism and may react aggressively. So in other words, think of a person who has a very thin skin. So in other words, for them, it's very important that people think of them positively, and when anyone says anything negatively about them, they overreact to the situation. So in other words, those people are going to be very high on narcissism. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a narcissistic personality disorder, but yet they just may be very high in narcissism. And generally, what those individuals tend to show is a sense of entitlement, a lack of empathy, have a lot of arrogance, and a tendency to exploit other people for their own selfish needs in that particular instance. So in other words, they continue to do those behaviors to continue to inflate their sense of self-worth, even though they don't necessarily actually believe that they have a lot of self-worth. So it's not necessarily that they believe it in themselves, they just want to feel that they actually have it, but even though they don't really believe that they have that high self-worth. We also see personality disorder being a predictor of individuals' aggression and violence in some specific cases, and ultimately these are individuals that display that display very prolonged senses of aggression. And ultimately these people show unreliability, irresponsibility, a disregard for the rights of others, a lack of remorse for their actions or the effects of their behavior towards other individuals. So ultimately what we see here with antisocial personality disorder are what we would end up calling individuals who have potential criminal behaviors, or what we would end up calling as the psychopath in terms of their antisocial behavior. So what do we find with these individuals with antisocial personality disorder? Like I mentioned, they violate the rights of others through aggression and even antisocial behavior. They're what we end up calling sociopaths or psychopaths. We tend to have quite a bit of risk factors associated with antisocial personality disorder, such as having biological disruptions, having lower socioeconomic status, and having a family history of dysfunction and psychopathology that might potentially result in them developing an antisocial personality disorder. We also see that they tend to be very charming and highly intelligent individuals, but yet again, we do definitely see that they tend to violate those rights of others through those aggression or violent acts. Now, we also do tend to see that what's called the psychopathic trio, and with the psychopathic trio, as children, we may see that they may tend to have fire setting, cruelty to animals, or also excessive bedwetting as a potential predictor associated with individuals who may suffer from antisocial personality disorder. Now here, for instance, when we look at different examples of individuals who may potentially have antisocial personality disorder, we have our very famous cases of Ted Bundy. And when you think about each one of these, think to yourself, does he or she fit the criteria for antisocial personality disorders? And also, based on their history, what kind of risk factors did they have? And one of the things that we'll discuss much later on in the semester, when we talk specifically about serial killers, we'll revisit some of these specific questions associated with the risk factors associated with their upbringings in terms of some case histories. We also see the cases of Jeffrey Dahmer and Charles Manson as being individuals who may fit the profiles associated with antisocial personality disorder, and even individuals such as the Unabomber, and other individuals that we see as potentially having these types of personality issues. Now, we also see in terms of other theories of aggression that when we look at components associated with situational factors such as boredom, an individual's ability to have impulse control and mood regulation tend to be very good predictors associated with an individual's aggression or even violence. Boredom seems to be a very good predictor associated with an individual acting upon violence or aggression, especially that if they are not maintaining themselves busy with other ideas or with other behaviors, they might potentially lead them to actually acting upon those specific behaviors solely based on the idea of boredom. Also, the presence of a weapon in the vicinity of an individual or of the home might potentially also lead an individual to acting out aggressively or violently. Again, alcohol and drugs. Looking at the aspects of anabolic steroids, and even having what's called the disinhibition hypothesis that looks at the idea that they are not inhibited by anything to ultimately create some of their negative behaviors that they might display in the future. Now, also, we mentioned the aspects associated with cultural expectations for violence. Now, there are some specific cultures or some specific societies that recommend that violence be displayed by other individuals, and if violence is not displayed by those individuals, they're going to be looked upon negatively. So think, for instance, in American culture, if little boys are not tough, if little boys don't engage in playing contact sports like football, if they don't play hockey, if they don't play other types of contact sports, but yet they dedicate themselves to playing some other types of sports that are not contact, or they don't even play sports at all, they may be looked upon negatively, and they may be even bullied or called names because of their disinterest in having aggression or violence being displayed, because again, those are cultural expectations. Especially when we look at militaristic cultures actually have higher levels of aggression and violence as being socially acceptable. So here again, when you look at American culture, we definitely are a very militaristic culture. Our military drives a lot of the identity of who it is that we are as a nation and as a people. And that also tends to be a higher level predictor in terms of our ability to accept aggression and violence that are displayed upon others. Like I also mentioned, instinct is a major issue that seems to play a role in terms of predicting an individual's violence and aggression. We see that in humans we have a natural aggressive and violent instinct because traditionally the more aggressive humans survived and passed on their genetic code to other children. So they were the ones who were much more likely to actually survive in cases of fights breaking out, or in potential other serious situations that their life might be threatened. So if we look at this aspect or the anthropological view of survival of the fittest, the ones who are the most fittest to survive are the ones who are going to potentially display that aggression and violence and be able to pass on their genetic code to others. Now, when we look at the distinction of different crimes or violent crimes come in many different shapes and forms. The two that we'll talk about here for our purposes in class are the aspects of homicide, murder, and also rape that we'll be discussing in our particular cases. So what are the differences between homicide and murder? Homicide is defined as the killing of another human being caused by another. There must be a life in terms of the other person who is being killed in this particular instance. The individual must be born alive or be alive at the time of the killing in order for there to be a homicide. So in the case of where another individual were to shoot or do something that would be aggressive or violent towards a dead body, that would not be considered to be a homicide. While murder, on the other hand, is the unlawful killing of a human being committed with malice, either being expressed or it being implied in terms of the malice. So there doesn't have to be overt malice being expressed to the individual, but there could also be implied malice of the individual wanting to commit this particular act in this particular instance. So when we think of murder, like most crimes, murder has really two components: the physical act of the crime and then the intent, which is the much more the psychological aspect or the mental aspect. So when we think about the physical act itself of the crime, the physical aspect of the crime is called the actus reus, while the mental aspect of the crime is called the mens rea. So sometimes extremely reckless behavior can substitute for intent. In terms of an example, think of someone who places a bomb on a plane to destroy incriminating evidence, which is on the plane. Intentional homicide has been committed if the plane explodes and people are killed as a result. Such a homicide is intentional, even if the individual had no actual desire to kill anyone on board the plane in this particular instance. So even though the individual didn't want to kill anyone, if individuals do die, then there is a murder that has taken place in that particular instance. Now, also with murder, we do have the aspect of the deadly weapon being taken into consideration. So, if a deadly weapon is present, that does help to establish intent of the individual. So ultimately, if there is an intent to commit great or serious bodily harm, for instance, shooting someone in a non-vital area of the body, and death occurs, it's still going to be considered murder. So if you were to shoot somebody, let's say in the arm or in the foot, and even though they don't right away die, but they die later of complications associated with that violent act, then that would still be considered a murder in that particular case. Now, there is also what's called the depraved heart killing, where a defendant is guilty of murder if he engages in unusually reckless behavior, such as when an individual drives at very high speeds, driving 100 miles an hour through a school zone, and potentially killing someone in that particular case. Now, there's also what's called the felony murder rule that holds that when a death occurs in the process of a felony, murder has been committed. So here, in this particular case, a felony crime is taking place, and someone dies during that felony. Now a murder has actually been committed at that point. Usually, in order for the rule to hold, the felony must be an inherently dangerous one, such as rape, burglary, arson, or even robbery. Now, it's very important for us to also understand the issue is so in other words, in order for the felony murder rule to hold, the defendant's actions must have been the proximate cause of the death, or the death must have been foreseeable as a possible result of the defendant's action. So in other words, let's say that the felony occurs, but the individual dies 3 weeks later because of some other particular reason. They got sick or they were in a car crash. They can no longer blame that individual for having committed the murder, but if the individual dies during the felony actions itself, then the individual may be held responsible in that particular instance. Now, we also see that another general requirement for the felony murder rule to hold is that the criminal act be malice in sen, which is wrongful within itself because it violates a natural law or moral code, and again, such as rape or robbery. Crimes that are not malum in sen are malum prohibitum, or made crimes by statute. So, for instance, white-collar crimes in these particular cases. Now, there are also degrees of murder that need to be taken into consideration as different levels of murder that may exist. So we do also have what's called first-degree murder versus second-degree murder, with first-degree murder having premeditation and deliberation, where premeditation means that the person did in fact reflect, even if it is just for a few seconds, while deliberation means that the person acted with a cool head without sudden excitement to being able to create that murder in that particular instance, while second-degree murder is malice afterthought without actual deliberation in those instances. So what is second-degree murder? Second-degree murder is considered the following four issues: killing with malice afterthought but without premeditation and deliberation, killing which results from an act done with intent to do great bodily harm, killing which results from an act done with wanton disregard of human risk, and also, in some jurisdictions, killing committed in the course of other crimes, for instance, in other words, less serious felonies in those particular instances. Now, we also have what's called voluntary manslaughter, and again, the distinction here of voluntary versus involuntary. With voluntary manslaughter, we have intentional homicide under mitigating circumstances. So the most common mitigating circumstance is the heat of passion of killing. So in other words, a person may commit a murder in those particular cases while an argument is occurring, or for instance with adultery or mutual combat that may be taking place. And an intentional homicide committed under mitigating circumstances in those particular cases. The common law definition that we actually have for voluntary manslaughter is an intentional homicide committed under these mitigating circumstances. So again, looking at that aspect of that heat of passion killing that may take place in those particular instances. So what is involuntary manslaughter? With involuntary manslaughter, we actually see an unintentional homicide committed without malice, which is neither justified nor excused. So in other words, a person did not have the intent to kill another person, but an individual dies in that particular instance. That person now has involuntary manslaughter that may have occurred. So in other words, let's say, for instance, a person crashes into another individual and a person dies as a result of that crash, even though the person had no malice and no real intention to create that kind of damage, and they were not reckless in their driving behavior, they may still be there still may be an issue with involuntary manslaughter in those particular cases. With involuntary manslaughter, there are also two types. We have what are called criminal negligence manslaughter and wrongful act manslaughter. With criminal negligence manslaughter, these results from conduct that involves a high degree of risk of death or serious injury, while wrongful act manslaughter is the killing that occurs in the commission of an unlawful act not amounting to a felony. So such an unlawful act must usually be in malum in sen. So for instance, the aspect of many traffic deaths falling again into that category associated with involuntary manslaughter. Now, with homicides, there are some homicides that are not necessarily crimes, and some of these are what we call justifiable homicides or excusable homicides. The justifiable homicides are the ones that are authorized by the law, such as with self-defense, depending on the state that you live in, defense of others, soldiers in combat, or even police shootings when lawful and necessary are considered justifiable homicides in those instances, while excusable homicides that are not authorized by the law, but they are excused in case of an individual in extreme duress. So for instance, an individual who's been kidnapped against their will and they're trying to escape, that may be considered duress. For necessity reasons, involuntary intoxication, mistake of law or fact, or even incapacity that may potentially occur. So in other words, a child may have created the homicidal act, but may have had no intention of actually committing that, and it may have been accidental in its nature. Now, other types of violent crimes that exist include such things as assault, battery, and also rape. With assault, we talk about the intent or threat to inflict harm upon a person, or an intentional placing of another person in apprehension of being harmed, while battery is the unlawful and unwanted application of force to the person of another or to an extension of the other. Now, the last aspect that we're going to talk about is the issue of rape. And with rape, we do talk about two different types of rape that exist, what we call common law rape and also what we call statutory rape. With common law rape, we see unlawful sexual intercourse with a female without her consent. It would be rape for a man to have intercourse with a woman who has fainted, is drugged, intoxicated, unconscious, or insane. So here an individual, a female who is unable to be able to say no in those particular instances because they fainted, they are drugged, or they're intoxicated or unconscious, or are not in the right mindset to be able to give consent. In those particular instances, going to be called common law rape. In that particular instance, with statutory rape, this is the kind of rape that, other than common law rape, which is created by statute, here the offense consists of having sexual intercourse with a female or a male under the statutory age, which usually, but isn't always, 16 years of age, depending again on the state that you may live in. So here, individuals who are younger than that age are not considered to be able to give proper permission or consent to be able to have sexual intercourse take place in those instances. Now, later on in the semester, when we do talk about other types of violent crimes, we will revisit the issues of murder and also the issues of rape in much greater detail to discuss specific instances where, especially with eyewitness testimonies, specific emotional aspects associated with the crimes that have taken place or with these incidents ultimately may drive individuals' perception in terms of what happened during the rape, in terms of identification of individuals, and also perceptions of the individuals who have been murdered, the person who murdered, the person who raped, and also the person who has been raped in those particular instances, and the perceptions associated with how others view them in terms of testimonies and in court settings. That wraps up our discussion for this week's discussion associated with aggression and violent crimes. This week we do also have a quiz and also a discussion board that are due, so please make sure to go on Blackboard and check the due dates for each of those, so that way we can make sure that we're staying on track with our due dates in terms of our assignments. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns associated with this week's lecture or course content, and I'll be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Have a great rest of your week, and I will be talking to everyone soon.